Hi, everyone. Welcome to our live webinar about forming P3 direct agreements with FSC certificate holders. I'm Elena McCullough. I'm a biologist intern with Wahkohtowin Development. I've been doing outreach for this project, and if you've watched the recorded FSC webinars on our website, you probably recognize my voice. Today, I'm here asking some questions about FPIC and direct agreements to David Flood, our general manager. So I'll have him introduce himself now.
This is great. Thanks so much, Elena, and really happy to join everybody and be part of the webinar series that we've been recording and facilitating. I am the general manager of Wahkohtowin Development. I've been doing this work for the last 5 years. And over that same period of time, I've reacquainted myself with FSC Canada as it went through the whole process of coming about and forming a new standard. And I've served on the board actually for the last 2 terms, and my final term is ending this coming November. So I'm currently chair of the board of FSC Canada, while Wahkohtowin has engaged in the ECCC project that is designed to increase Indigenous engagement across Canada, wherever there is FM certificate holders currently, as the new standard comes into effect fully in effect in 2020. The FM certificate holders are meant to basically take on the responsibility of fulfilling some of the key elements of what the new standards makes available and strengthens in regards to UNDRIP and FPIC in particular to this conversation. Perhaps Isabelle can briefly introduce herself as well.
Sure. Hi, I'm Isabelle Allen. I'm the project forester for Wahkohtowin. I'm involved in this ECCC project so far through the High Conservation Value Forests webinar.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Isabelle. So let's get right into the first question then. What is free, prior, and informed consent, and how does it relate or compare to Aboriginal and treaty rights in Canada?
Well, I think for most people, what's emerging is the two are quite synonymous. One is an act or action. The other one is a pre-existing, unfettered, inherent jurisdiction and right. The relationship of actually where a third party might engage First Nations to achieve free, prior, and informed consent, including governments, would be the act or action. And really what the goal is to acknowledge and recognize that inherent place that First Nations have with their territories within the jurisdiction of what is now called Canada, understanding that territories of nations existed prior to the formation of Canada. And it interrelates with the international vehicle that provides articles, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that has been now adopted by the majority of countries around the world, including Canada, to which the new National Forest Standard has propped up and said that the new standard and the way third parties, mainly forest companies, forest sector, will voluntarily seek to achieve FPIC with affected communities. The challenge statement around that is we understand that the provincial governments all have their own forest legislation provincially as it's designed under the federalism context. And each province will also have its own approaches to consultation. So when it comes to the honor of the crown or the duty to consult, therein which lies the differentiation between what industry will do and what the provincial governments may do, or federal government may do in relation to forestry and forest management. In the voluntary context for the standard, there's a guidance document, as well as some indicators, as we're seeing here under 3.2, where industry must work to fulfill and do its best efforts to engage affected communities in establishing P3 direct agreements. which the agreements themselves can act as a vehicle to achieve free, prior, and informed consent.
And a follow-up question to that, kind of a series of questions. Isn't consultation up to the province or the Crown, according to Section 35 of Canada's Constitution? What incentive is there for forest industry to take on that responsibility and not defer it? And for a bit of context, what does the current consultation process from the Crown look like?
So that's an action-packed set of questions, and I guess I'll tackle it in a little bit of a reverse order to, what do consultation regimes look like across different provinces? They're not all the same. Typically, no one province, as an example, provides the same structure or framework to consultation for a variety of reasons. And I use the word geopolitical context. So in the geopolitical context of provinces, for example, out to the west, we have a Chilcotin decision that's based on title. And in that context, BC is actually advancing UNDRIP and actually applying within its own legislation in a voluntary way as the province, as the federal government contemplates what to do with UNDRIP in moving its own consultation regime forward so that FPIC is actually embedded in a collaborative relationship with the affected nations in the province of BC. A lot of it has to do with pre-existing treaties, the settlement and colonization of Canada from south to north. You go up far enough north, there's a devolution of federalism with the Innu communities. The province of BC has a James Bay Cree agreement, and a part two to that. So consultation across Canada with nations between provinces varies. Just as on our East Coast, with the emergence and strengthening of the Mi'kmaq national government, again, the Eastern provinces need to contemplate how they're going to meaningfully consult with First Nations. So at the end of the day, in the legal context, provincial governments are required through their duty to consult and honor the Crown as defined in the Supreme Court of Canada decisions. They hold that ultimate responsibility. As it relates to the P3 the standard and P3, the incentive for industry to actually, I wouldn't say take on the duty to consult or be the honor of the Crown, but what actually helps if they were actually lead consultation is that at the end of the day, the forest sector is the main benefactor from the consumptive use right of the wood fiber that the Crown offers through licensing. So if they want certainty around the consumptive use of that product, as well as access to international markets, which the voluntary certification system provides and is meant to enhance in terms of the way they do business, in terms of creating benefit back to industry, then it would seem appropriate that industry take an interest and take a lead. In some instances, I'll use where we are here in Ontario, the Forest Management Planning Regulation has provided a bit of a nuance and a change in 2017 when the regulation has actually indicated that delegation of responsibility to industry around the annual work schedule. So that's where the Crown could delegate procedural aspects of consultation to industry, and annual work schedules are the annual operating plans that are precipitated out of the 10-year forest management plans. So it would seem very appropriate that industry lead that direct engagement and consultation with affected communities. And there's the opportunity. It's through that requirement of engagement, whether it's the standard that's asking for engagement or a delegated procedural aspect for engagement, or just good corporate social responsibility of the company to want to go out and engage the affected communities with or without certification, is that there's all kinds of good reasons to do this. And the courts have ruled quite clearly on that, is to where there may be a potential for impact to Indigenous communities, upfront, early, transparent, well-informed engagement is the best approach to creating positive outcomes and relationships.
Thanks, David. Just to break it down a little bit more, could you describe what kind of timeline an FPIC process usually takes? And could you break it down into steps or stages?
Yes. There's I'll say good news and bad news. Good news and bad news. The good news is it's never finite. And some people would say, well, that's also bad news. But I look at it as, the balance between it's going to be an ongoing relationship. Forestry doesn't happen in a 1-month cycle and it's done. Forestry happens at the landscape level. It'll have legacy impacts. It'll have road corridor development. It'll affect species of interest and priority to communities. Conservation interests of communities are certainly up for discussion. So when you think about the strategic and operational components of what are the interests of the communities over the long term, as well as the localized annual interests, or within that 10-year forest management plan, interests of the communities, there's a lot to manage there and package. So it really will be an ongoing relationship when you design an FPIC style agreement. So that's good news. And I really don't see a bad news, because for some people that feel it should be handled in a one-window approach and there's no more conversation to be had, that's very short-sighted. There's many benefits to be gained from actually creating those longer-term, more deeper, meaningful relationships through FPIC style direct agreements. As far as the steps and stages, I think that's part of what we're trying to do on the phone here, is to flesh out, where would a community start? How does a community start brokering this conversation with the certificate holders? And I would offer just a few introductory steps into getting it initiated. Is one, if you are adjacent to a forest management certified area, or in or adjacent to it, simply picking up the phone and talking to the sustainable forester or the chief forester, or maybe an operations forester comes by from time to time, simply outright stating that your community at the governance level wants to explore direct agreement as it relates to the standard. It could be as easy as that. Some would opt to formalize it and send a letter introducing that there's an increased awareness of the opportunity, and that there's a need, and you're inviting the company to come and have that conversation with your community. And others might need to be encouraged through what's called the certification auditing process, where if you're not hearing a lot from the company, or you haven't heard a response from the company, or nobody's really picking up the phone, but you're definitely trying to raise your community's ability to communicate, would be to report that to the certifying body, who also should be contacting you either through annual surveillance audits or through the full renewal process that the third-party certifying body is meant to achieve. So one way or the other, you can do it independently, proactively, to go out and get that introduction underway. Formalize it in writing. It's always worthwhile to do that. And then if all else fails, and that the industry, the certificate holder industry, isn't voluntarily continuing to commit to outreach, which they really ought to be doing on some consistent basis, then you certainly should be able to report that to the certifying body on any given annual surveillance audit. And that information is all publicly available. Who the certifying body is that the company engages, the last report that was done. There's links that are available through FSC Canada that'll actually show you all this public and transparent information and communication. From there on, I mean, the steps to actually, to drive and arrive at an FPIC style direct agreement, it could take as little as 3 months. It could take up to a full year. it really just depends on the rigor and the interest of the parties to work through the exercise of really trying to understand what's needed in a direct agreement by both parties to come out with a positive outcome that'll actually achieve on an ongoing basis FPIC relationship with the community.
So how would a community get a binding agreement with industry? You touched a bit on how the process is initiated, but maybe you could give some more details, like who represents the community in negotiations and are lawyers involved?
That's perfect. Really good questions. And most communities have different forms of existing consultation protocols that they're actually publicly available, maybe perhaps on their website, or that have been developed by legal negotiating teams because they've used them on other projects in the area or region affecting their territory. So those are useful to really explore what you already do as a community. And maybe you have a good guiding process that you can draw upon and actually present to industry in this case. And if it ultimately requires either legal representation through the negotiation or legal representation to review the final document, in most cases, the industry partner will provide for reasonable reimbursement costs for that exercise. And generally speaking, to create a positive, grounded relationship, it's worth doing the legal review. In terms of, as I said, the launch or the initiation of the agreement, I mean, the good news is if you've tuned into this particular webinar, we're actually going to provide an example of a working template that I personally have actually utilized to arrive at a negotiated agreement with industry. And so congratulations for logging in and tuning in and checking out our website. The template will be posted shortly after our video is posted. But the design of the actual agreement itself, again, it should be workable. You may have seen 60 pages of legal agreement where it's very challenging to read lawyer speak, if you will, or law or legal language speak. What this template as an example provides is all of the key measures of defining the relationship, what it does and doesn't do. It's not meant to erode or degrade inherent rights and jurisdiction interests. Again, it respects that there's a government-to-government relationship with Canada and the Constitution and Section 35 protected rights. But more importantly, it helps between the industry and the community to actually activate or motivate that ongoing dialogue between strategic and operational. These are two things that are never going to go away. So the more the communities identify, their landscape level use, their watershed level use and occupancy. I often explain that my experience with our communities is that we're rekindling our relationship with our traditional lands because of the oppression that our communities have come through. And we're only now learning to turn outside of the federal land base and say, here's what's important to us. And that voice should have been always present since the time of, it was present before the time of making treaties and bilateral agreements with provincial federal governments. But more importantly, the voice should never have gone away. So we're trying to play a little bit of catch up there. And that's where I think, in the spirit of reconciliation and honoring the experience and respecting the experience that our communities have come through, is to create that time and space. And that's part of what these agreements allow, so that free, prior, and informed consent is truly relationship driven. And wherever there are disputes, that both certificate holder and the First Nations can find a way to create a dialogue space to provide the solution. And I think that's where a lot of people are saying and get into that discussion around veto versus consent versus, let's actually try and create a conversation space around, a mutual agreed to solution, as opposed to, something can be done or not done. Because the more advanced that the communities take the time to talk about their needs over the long term, the less likely you're going to run into major issues such as this, where maybe the dispute resolution needs to be utilized. But all these things are part of a journey. This is not something that you can craft in 3 to 6 months and expect it to just run itself. It requires, putting human capital to work in this, and more and more communities are developing lands and resource departments to actually staff up and provide that direct contact with industry and the membership to actually create those solutions.
To expand on that answer, could you provide a description of the key elements of a good P3 direct agreement?
Yes, for sure. In any agreement, the spirit and intent of acting in good faith and transparency will always be the most important. Who's meant to talk to who to get the most positive outcomes out of the relationship? So communication is going to be key. How are things communicated, and how is that interaction? Who's responsible for the interaction to implement the agreement? So that pathway really needs to be invested into and supported to create these positive outcomes. These agreements, as I suggested earlier, need to be both thinking about long-term strategic pathways of creating solutions, as well as any annual operation needs a form of variation, protection of Indigenous values and areas of special cultural or spiritual significance. Through the full utilization of the standard through time, there's all kinds of scales of interaction that First Nations will have with the land base that makes up that forested certified area. Many of our traditional territories are larger than these single forest areas. But at the end of it, it's important to always have the flexibility to deal with dispute resolution, and the duration of the agreement and its ability to change it and renew it. What happens 5 years ago might not be what is of interest today, and 5 years into the future, there might be a need to change some of the key elements of the agreement to keep the parties working together in a positive manner. So those are just some of the big moving parts of the agreement that I think are key and critical.
So once a community has negotiated with industry, can changes be made to a binding agreement once it's finalized, and how would?
Yep, I think I caught the full of the question there, Isabelle. Yes, that certainly was supported in a good agreement will allow flexibility for any amendments that need to be made from time to time as agreed to by the parties. That's always going to be critical. There should at minimum be at least an annual check-in on the agreement, knowing that throughout the year there will be ongoing implementation relationship work being done, meaning the forester, the operations forester, the woodland supervisor, the chief forester. There's probably a range of people that are going to be involved at key times for points of contact with the community. And there's a few other nuances that that I've seen in variations where communities do things like, the primary producer is a lumber mill. We need this year to add on a certain number of bundles of lumber to help offset the cost of building homes, or a special structure, whether it's a cultural building or, and again, these usually have space in the agreement so that when you review the annual agreement and you're forward looking, is that something new has come up and you want to make that request. Some really nice work around powwow grounds and bringing in large stumps with root wads partially attached. And the flexibility of actually putting some cash monetary contributions to help support the relationship itself, meaning investing in somebody from the community to be that liaison back and forth. So as the relationship grows and the community's interests grow around forestry, forest management, and participation in business development, entrepreneur development, there's so many moving parts that can be adhered to a direct agreement. And again, it creates positive working relationships into the future.
Great. So I'm just going to jump ahead here to a question that I really wanted to ask, which is how could a community use these tools to achieve a goal such as herbicide reduction, as an example?
Yes, that's a hot topic across Canada and I think around the world, whether it's in forestry or outside of forestry, but the use of herbicides generally and the active ingredient glyphosate and its impacts to the natural environment. What's unique about the direct agreement itself is that it certainly has a place in that conversation, but more importantly, the FSC is the international body, and then FSC Canada with its standard. There is the ongoing element within the indicators to actually reduce the use of herbicide over a designated period of time. So that is the obligation and responsibility of the certificate holder, is to identify and work on pathways for that outcome to happen and have a plan. So when you think of the direct agreement that the First Nation might have, you could actually put that as one of the objectives within said agreement, that you will work with industry to collaboratively build that plan and implement to zero with regards to herbicide application. Highly plausible. In fact, our Wahkohtowin communities have been working with Was Tembec, now RIAM, who has maintained FSC certification for well over 20 years, 25 plus years on a number of their forest tenures in Northern Ontario. And we've exercised a herbicide alternative program in collaboration with them, where we are driving at trying to figure out how to get to zero and utilizing various ways to contemplate how to get there. At the end of the day, it also allows for a larger voice between industry and First Nations, perhaps to advocate to the provincial government and federal government to contemplate, figuring out ways to deregulate, as well as change some policies around silviculture renewal contributions that'll actually help industry with the pathway to move away from herbicide spraying as seen as a cost-efficient, effective way to maybe some of these slightly higher cost ways of doing it, but achievable because the right resources are being invested into, whether it's stock size, manual treatments, which cost more money per hectare than aerial herbicide spray. So this is certainly an area I can imagine most, if not all, First Nations are raising their hands, saying, we need that vehicle, we need that conversation, we need to know that there is movement in that direction to getting to zero. So that is the good news about the standard, as well as the role that First Nations can play in bringing about the cessation of the use of herbicide.
Thanks, David. You've given us very insightful answers. I have one final question for you. Does FSC have a standard dispute resolution process? And at what point in the FPIC process is a customized dispute resolution process typically established?
So currently in the new standard, the certificate holder is required to have publicly available dispute resolution processes. And that serves a number of purposes, and it's not just isolated to First Nations. It could be dispute resolution brought on by other industry, other stakeholders that have an interest in the forest that aren't jurisdictional, such as the province or federal government, and other businesses at different scales, whether they're local operators or tourism operators. But for First Nations, I would encourage that a dispute resolution process be distinctly identified so that it is culturally relevant to the way in which the community will resolve a dispute with industry. But at the same time, understanding that the company at large, to satisfy certification and maintain it, has to have a publicly available system or method as well. So that's that internal working piece of where and how are disputes handled by the certificate holder. And what's also interesting is wherever, say, an Indigenous community, First Nations, are feeling like they need to elevate or go beyond what exists between the parties as a dispute resolution process, but launch a stronger complaint about the certificate holder. It's a stepwise approach to moving the complaint to be addressed by other bodies. So FSC Canada itself doesn't directly handle disputes. What it is the pathway is to actually elevate it through the certificate holder's certifying body that issued the certificate. And that actually then allows for the complaints to be elevated to FSC Canada will support and review and make available opinion. But at the end of the day, this is an international standard. And if there's meant to be variations or rule setting around whether or not the certificate should be maintained or revoked, those will come through the certifying body's complaint process around the certificate itself. So this is not whether or not they're following, this is not all related to all the direct indicators within this standard. The complaint could be around any parts of the indicators within the standard. And then if you've chosen as a body to go through the dispute resolution and you feel like you've exhausted it or utilized it, then there still is the certifying body complaints process.
Great. Thanks,
So,
David.
quite a few check valves, but I mean, those are there, which are great, right? Those are there, which are great. But it's really probably more important to spend time on figuring out, you know, the relationship piece, the direct agreement piece, and actually seeing the standard for what is available for communities to utilize to give best representation of the way they see their traditional lands needing to be stewarded, that their natural law interpretations, the key priorities to reinvigorate that rekindling exercise I spoke about, and seeing that there is ecosystem gap analysis. It is meant to create a sustainable forest management regime. The communities can set aside high conservation value areas. And the good news is, again, going to our website, we've started to create these pretty cool little webinars that actually hopefully create digestible, 15, 20-minute conversations around the new standard, the indicators, and now this webinar, as well as high conservation value forest that Isabelle will have up and available shortly. So thank you for honoring us for your time to have watched the video. And I'll leave it to Elena to close and take it from there.
Great. Well, I think we covered a lot of information in a fairly short amount of time. So I think now we'll wrap up this sort of formal Q&A portion, and we'll open the floor to any questions from any of the participants out there.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thanks.